Good afternoon to you. Today I am going to continue from where Pastor Madenge left us last Sunday. Last Sunday, if you are here, our visitors, I know that you are not here, but I do hope that you'll be able to carry forward with us in the story that you're going to look at today. Last week, Madenge took us through 1 Samuel chapter 17. He introduced us to young David. Today, I want us to look at 1 Samuel chapter 18 and continue with the narrative. And I wanted to say this as I begin. You see, this is a narrative. I'm going to look at 1 Samuel 18. I will do a bit of referencing to the story of David and Saul and Jonathan before that, and some referencing after that chapter. I do hope that you'll be able to move along with me. And as I do that, because these are narratives, it's very hard to, say lesson 1, 2, 3. My hope and my prayer, and I also acknowledge that, our lives are, each one of us is living a very particular life. The experiences of your life, your perspectives, everyone has a complex system around. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, everyone is living a very individual life. And so as I read through the story, my hope is that as you read through it, you will pick out what lesson matters for your life in this season. So I pray that the Lord will help you to open your eyes so that you can see, that you will receive it in your heart, and that it will work on your particular life in this moment for you. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah? Nimeko complicated, but I hope you understand. I'm saying pick the lessons. That's what I'm saying. The way they apply to your individual life. Yeah. Okay, so like I said, Pastor Madenge introduced us to young. The Bible calls him handsome, but Madenge made him sound cute. Young, cute David, who in full trust in God and total commitment to God's honor, kills Goliath. And so at the end of chapter 17, which is where he left us last week, Saul, impressed by the young man's heart and his courage and his ability to do what he did, asks Abner, who is the commander of the king's army at the time, he asks him who David is, which is a strange question because in chapter 16, you see, God had already departed from Saul because Saul had disobeyed God twice at this point, and Samuel had already told Saul that God had rejected him. And the evil spirit that God sent had already come upon Saul. And in looking for someone who could help him, because this spirit was called a distressing spirit, it would cause him unhappiness and despair. You know, that what we may call depressive episodes in our time, this spirit would cause him that. And then the men around him told him, we know of a young man who knows how to play the lyre, and when he does, it will make you feel better. And Saul said, okay, send this young man. And he actually sends messengers to Jesse and says, give me your son David. And they call David, and up to that point, up to 1 Samuel 17, David has been serving Saul as one of his armor bearers who plays the lyre for him, and he calms down. This is chapter 16. And in 17, after David does this, Saul asks, who is this young man? But you know how it is with bosses and interns, isn't it? Someone can have served around you for a long time, but you've never quite seen them. Or you're the intern who has never quite been seen. That's why we laughed when Bento was here and Judy saying, I won't forget you, I will see you. So Saul has never quite seen David, who has been in his palace for a while up to this point, who has served him up to this point, and then this happens. So when he asks Abner, whose son is this? Abner says, I do not know. Even Abner, who has been there. And if you watch these epic movies, like Judy said, I'm a youth pastor, so I'm always trying to use movies to explain my point. If you've watched these epic movies, you know that in the throne room, the king is not usually seated alone, isn't it? The commander of his army is there. Some other soldiers are there. People, usually he is with people. And so Abner, who also has been there, has never quite seen David either. And so he says, I actually don't know. And Saul sends him to go and find out who David is. As chapter 17 ends, it ends by Saul is asking David, whose son are you, young man? And David says, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. And then in chapter 18, this is, allow me to read through chapter 18, and then we will go back now to the story, going through the story and picking lessons from the story. 1 Samuel 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. These pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul, with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. For Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that. But David said to Saul, Who am I, and what is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David. And when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. Then Saul ordered his attendants, Speak to David privately and say, Look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law. They repeated these words to David. But David said, Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. When Saul's servant told him what David had said, Saul replied, Say to David, the king wants no other prize for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Can you imagine counting? 200, 59, 101, 130. And men should learn from this. Doubling the dowry is not too bad. Can help with oneness. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. So as we enter chapter 18, this is in verse 1, we leave David called into the king's presence and being asked, Who are you? And he says, he is David, the son of Jesse. In verse 1 of chapter 18, the first verse says, After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. Presumably, as chapter 18 begins, Jonathan is in the presence of the king, as is David and Abner and maybe other men, court officials, soldiers, whoever they may be. And you know how it is in those epic movies, the king is seated and the one who is summoned is, somewhere there and the king is talking to him. Now, it is obvious that the story is contracted. All we know is, who are you? I am David, son of Jesse. But because verse 1 starts by saying, after he had finished talking to him, we can assume that there was a bit of a longer conversation. Maybe Saul wanted to know, what led you to this? Why are you so courageous but you're so small? How did you become like this? Why were you not afraid of Goliath? And and on and on and on, trying to figure out how David had become this man that he had just met now freshly in chapter 17. Presumably, Jonathan is in hearing as David expresses to the king, is reintroduced to Saul, and is expressing to the king his heart, why he was not afraid, why the Philistine who defied his God should never have done that, why he trusted in God, why he knew that God would do this, explaining his heart, explaining his faith in the living God. And Jonathan is listening. Now, Jonathan was probably also listening to David in chapter 17, because David in his courage in chapter 17, Goliath is looking at him and despising him. And he says, I will feed you to the dogs and da. And David says, who are you to defy the armies of the living God? Today I will show you that there is no other God but. And he's talking in faith, and he runs, he charges towards Saul. And I'm sure because all the soldiers were there, Jonathan too was there. He must have listened to how David speaks of his God, how David is committed to the battles of God, to the salvation of Israel from the Philistines. He listens in chapter 17, and in chapter 18, he must have been in the king's presence as David talks about himself, about his heart, about his living faith in God. You see, I want to explain how it is that the Bible tells us that they became one in spirit. Earlier in chapter 14, I want to show you how similar Jonathan and David were. Jonathan was quite like David, because we see in chapter 14, I want us to go there, we're going to read this together. In chapter 14, the Israelites are camped somewhere, the Philistines are camped somewhere. It's like, kupimana, ready for a war. While they are camped, Jonathan wakes up one morning and he says to his armor bearer, let's go to the Philistine outpost. And no one knows about it. So he goes with him. This is I want us to read from verse 6, 1 Samuel 14, from verse 6 to 14. Says, Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Do you see, the language of Jonathan is very similar to David's language. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? And Jonathan here says, let's go to the outpost of those uncircumcised Philistines. They seem to even have similar language. And he says, perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. You can tell Jonathan's heart. Jonathan knows these people are against the people of God, and God is able to save us from their hand. And it is not about whether there is only two of us, whether there is the whole army. The thing is that God has an agenda to save Israel from Philistines, and he can do it whether by many or by few, because this is God's agenda. That's where Jonathan's heart is. So, the armor bearer says to him, do all that you have in mind to do. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. Jonathan said, come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding. And it's true, the Hebrews were hiding themselves at that point. They're crawling out. The men at the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we will teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Which is also something that David says, God will give you into my hands. Jonathan climbed up and using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him, the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. And after this, if you continue to read the story, the Lord sends a panic after Jonathan has done this and his armor bearer, and they are so panicked, the ground is shaking, they begin to kill each other, and the men in the Israelite camp are wondering what's happening at the Philistine outpost, and King Saul are looking, and Saul says, who is it that left our army? Because he didn't know that his son had gone to pursue the battles of God even without his father's knowledge. And at this point now the Israelites join in the battle, and God, in that particular battle, they defeat the Israelites. And so we see that on that day, by Jonathan's hand, the Lord saved Israel. So listening to Jonathan speak in chapter 14 and listening to David speak in chapter 17, it is obvious that both these men were bold, both had a real relationship with God, both trusted deeply in God, and both were committed to his plan and agenda for the salvation of Israel. And so as Jonathan is here, listening to David answering Saul's question, talking about giving an extended explanation of his heart and his faith in the living God, Jonathan knew that he and David had the same heart. And even though David had been in the palace before as an armor bearer, Jonathan could never have become close to him until this point when he hears, who are you? Know that thing, I usually like to say this and joke about it. It's like you're in a conference or in a meeting, and then someone speaks and you're like, who is that who spoke? Have you ever had that experience? You're like, so there's someone who sees things the way I do. I think this is what happens to Jonathan. Now, it would have been obvious to both Jonathan and David at this point that they were each other's threats to the throne. You see, Jonathan was the crown prince, isn't it? And kingship is by birth. So Jonathan knew, everyone knew, that after Saul dies, Jonathan would be king. But David knew in his heart, maybe Saul did not know, Jonathan did not know, but David knew in his heart, you might think you're going to become king because you're the king's son, but I have been anointed. You know, at this point, David has already been anointed king. But in actual reality, Jonathan, this may be news to you, but I am the one who is going to be king. And also, Jonathan, being the crown prince, looking at someone who has won this great victory for Israel, he may not have known that David was anointed, but it is possible to see. You know, if you're looking out for power and you're waiting in line for power, it is possible to see this man, the way he is loved by people, he is a threat to my kingdom. So ideally at this point, both men should know that they are each other's threats to the throne. And at this point, instead of becoming one in spirit, ideally, they should be eyeing each other, watching each other closely and suspiciously. Jonathan should have been looking at him and listening to him and thinking, nakuona wewe, and I will not allow you to be too close to this throne. And David should have been starting to position himself for, kidogo Saul will be out and I need to be there before Jonathan takes the seat. Ideally, that's what happens in human hearts and minds. But what is happening here instead is completely different. Jonathan is listening to David and he becomes one in spirit in David. Alas, two men on track for the same throne, yet because of their true love for God, commitment to his honor, and his agenda for Israel, not their own, they make a covenant of friendship. And they do this many times along the way. They make this covenant and swear oaths to each other continually for a few more times after this. They make a covenant of friendship that supersedes jealousy and ambition and personal interests, because they are both committed to who? God and his plan for Israel. Not their own, desires. In fact, we are told in this is back to chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18, verse 3 and 4, it says that Jonathan made a covenant with David, and because he loved him as himself, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. When Jonathan did this, effectively he was saying, I can see that God's hand is on you. I can see that God will save Israel through you. You should be the one who is dressed and armed as the crown prince. These rightfully belong to you. This is what Jonathan was saying. Only because he was submitted to God and committed to God's agenda to save Israel from her enemies was he able to perceive the hand of God on David, and was he willing to set aside his position rightfully by birth to honor God's choice. Only because he was committed to God and to God's agenda. David does not refuse to take these things. And what do you mean? No, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving of. David receives these items from Jonathan. He does not go on to say, as soon as he receives, you see, David knows he's anointed, but he doesn't go on to say, yeah, you should be giving me those things, and in fact, you should get out of the way because Saul needs to get out of the way. The Lord has rejected him. He needs to get out of the way, and I need to step into my rightful place as the new God-anointed king. No. David receives these things in humility. And I will tell you a definition of humility at some point, because usually, our warped understanding of humility is the one I just described. Me? No. I can't. How? It cannot be. No. You should have those things. That's what we usually read as humility. But here we see something different. David accepts them in humility, accepting that God had a plan for Israel through him, and then he continues to wait in humility for God to put him on that throne. Because it is God who put Saul on that throne. David was not going to take Saul out. He would wait for God to take Saul out and put him on that throne. Still humility. If the question of who was next to be king was not settled in both of these men's hearts, and if God's agenda was not their highest ambition, their friendship would never have been possible. It was only possible because they loved God and they loved each other more than they loved the throne. More than they loved the throne of Israel. You see, in our time, I have heard this many times in my circles on social media, in podcasts, when people are talking about this issue of friendship, I've heard people say things like, as you grow older, your circle gets smaller. You should be more careful. Who you share yourself with. You should be more selfish with yourself and with your time. I hear people saying things like, you need to gather people around you who grow you and benefit you. Many of us seek friendships that are stepping stones to where we want to be. Financially, romantically, maybe they are close to someone who you have your eyes set on. Positionally, maybe they are close to the king in your workplace or in some political place and you're trying to get tenders, whatever it is. And so they will be a stepping stone for you to get somewhere positionally. Get friends who speak of you in places where you cannot speak for yourselves. Gather people around you who will benefit you, and be selfish with yourself. You can't share yourself with everyone. These are the things that the world is teaching us about friendships. Many more of us are completely devoid of friendships. At our big age, we are still wondering, how do people make friends actually? Me, I don't have friends. I don't know how this thing is done. Here, in these first few verses of 1 Samuel 18, we are shown a picture of what a godly and committed friendship looks like. Hearts that find and know each other because they recognize depth of love for God, first and foremost. It is you seated somewhere, seated in a conference, like I was saying, in a meeting, in a random place, and you hear someone say something and you think, that could be my friend. Did they say that about that verse? Did they say that about the scriptures? Did they say that about prayer? Did they say that about where they usually go during the week? Hearts that find and know each other because they recognize the depth of love for God. Friendships that are not compromised by jealousy and selfish ambition because God and his agenda are their highest good. God's and his agenda are their highest ambition. Friendships, as we will see later on, that will serve to bring encouragement in very difficult and painful times, and friendships that will last beyond physical life. Because at some point, if you continue the story, you see Jonathan and David making pacts about their descendants after them. And I don't know whether you are seated there and wondering, how is it that I can get a godly friend? How can I get this kind of committed friendship that is not marked by jealousy, selfish ambition, selfish pursuits, personal interests, and things like this? Sometimes the reason you identify or become close with someone who is not a godly person is because your own heart is not that close to God at all. And even if there was to be a Jonathan in that space, they wouldn't recognize you. You are not the one they would pick. And sometimes, if I may push this a little further to romantic relationships, and some of us struggle with, oh my God, that guy, he's not a believer, but oh, he gets me. He is this and the other. What he is getting, the reason you feel gotten, is because the thing you need to be gotten is not a godly thing. That's why there's something that in your heart that latches onto someone who has no relationship with God, but which you, for some reason, identify with. This is in friendships, it's in romantic relationships. Something is not yet in your heart. You haven't yet gotten to a point where God's honor and the love of God and God's agenda are your highest ambition. It could be that it is business that's your highest ambition, or financial freedom, or whatever it is, or this and the other. And so when someone speaks that language, that's who your heart latches onto. And then later, when there's jealousy and selfish ambition and personal interest, you are surprised how friendships, betrayals, and all of that, you're thrown off, you don't understand. Because right from the beginning, your heart is not latching. Your heart does not recognize a heart that loves God. Because this is not your highest pursuit either. Tumesema we are picking lessons as we go, sindio? We shall go on. Going on with that story, our attention is immediately turned from this heartwarming, covenant-based friendship to terror that King Saul unleashes on David because a completely different man from his son, he is given to selfish ambition and to jealousy. In verse 5, so verse 5 kind of stands aside in the narrative because it kind of describes the life of David and Saul after. And then in verse 6, we come back to what happens immediately after the battle. So verse 5 says this: whatever mission Saul sent him on, this is after we're told about Jonathan giving his tunic, his bow, his sword, his belt to David. Now, we step aside from that, and then this is what the narrator says in verse 5. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. And then verse 6, we go back to when the men were returning home after David had come. But before we go to that verse 6, where the women bring problems that will refuse to end until the death of Saul and Jonathan, let me say something about David. You see, after this has happened and Jonathan has given him his tunic, his belt, signifying you are God's choice for this throne, we are told later that Saul still gets attacked. We have read it in chapter 18 by this evil, distressing spirit. And what we hear is that David is playing the lyre for him. Which is interesting because already David has joined the army. Already David is climbing rank in the army. He continues to serve Saul and to submit to Saul and to play music as he did as when he was an armor bearer before. Do you see how interesting that is? He knows who he is. He knows who God has anointed him to be, but he continues to submit himself to this kingship until God determines that this kingship should live. and does the job of an armor bearer, not an armor wearer. David shows what obedience is to this categorical command from the scriptures in 1 Peter chapter 2. Go with me to 1 Peter chapter 2, from verse 13, which says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh and evil, like Saul. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God." And this is what David was. David was conscious of God. And David was conscious of God's agenda. And so he continues to submit himself and play every role that Saul asks him to play, even the least of them, to serve this king, because that's the position God had him in. In the moment, I do think that many of us would do well to learn this lesson. Many of us need to learn this lesson. Because some of us in our workplaces, some of us are not even sure we are called. David was sure. He had actually been anointed. Mafuta imemwagwa. For some of us, we haven't had that experience. But because we know we are believers, we have already determined that we are Davids and that God wants us to run the agenda because we will run the agenda of God. And so we are already trying to get these evil and believing rulers out of the way. Not submitting ourselves to these authorities, not waiting on God, not even knowing what God's agenda is for that workplace. You just know you are a believer, therefore you should run the show. Many of us would need to learn this lesson, to submit ourselves to all human authority because we are conscious of God. Even if you know, some of us maybe know that God has actually anointed us to do that job, but he is not yet making a way for you. In fact, it looks like you will be kicked out, in fact. Submit yourself under every human authority because you are conscious of God. Now, enter the women in verse 7. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 18. In verse 6. The men are returning home. David has killed the Philistine. The women come out from all the towns of Israel. And this is what it says, to meet King Saul. But they are singing about who? David. You know how it was like with maandamano. Ukiangalia Nakuru, ukiangalia Kisumu, ukiangalia Mombasa, ukiangalia Nairobi, everyone is singing the same song. I don't know whether they had TVs, but I'm sure maybe the news, I don't know. But it was in every town. And everyone is singing one song. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his tens of thousands. The women causing trouble in men's lives. As married women, part of oneness that we have been taught in other conferences before is not to compare our husbands with other men. Tusije tukaleta shida zenye hazitaisha in the rest of our lives. If we are being honest, this thing is not cool. It's not nice when people are comparing your not so big giftings to another's very big giftings. And this thing happens even in church. You come, you lead a song, you lead worship. Unasonga hivi mtu mwingine anachukua mic. After that concert, everyone is saying, gosh, did you guys hear? Na wewe aki uliimba hata wewe. No one seems to remember. And you're thinking, in your heart you have a pain here in your stomach, but you're like, yeah, that was so good. And then you go and find your security in who? In God. It takes great security in God to not be thrown off balance when you're being compared to someone who has done exemplarily well in something that you are supposed to be good at. So we can understand Saul is the point. Maybe we know how to cover our anger better, but we can understand him. Now, an obvious difference can immediately be marked here between David's and Saul's responses to public love and fame. Now, both men, in 1 Samuel chapter 9 is where we are introduced to Saul, where Saul is brought. God tells Samuel, I'll show you this is the man who is to be the first king of Israel, because Israelites have asked for a king. Both men are drawn from obscurity. Saul is looking for donkeys. His father's donkeys are lost. He's looking for donkeys. David is looking after sheep. As they are there, both men are called handsome. Did you know that Saul was also handsome? Ama amechoma sana hata mtu anasahau that David tu ndio anakaa ni kama he was handsome. Even Saul was described as handsome. In fact, of Saul it is added he was a head taller than anyone else. So both men come from obscurity. Both men are handsome. Saul is even described as taller. At first glance, when you look at Saul's story, at first glance, it seems that Saul is even more humble than David. Why? Because when Samuel comes with him and he says, you should read this story, this is in chapter 9, and he says some words, because Saul goes, they say there is a seer somewhere, the seer will help them to find the donkeys. As they are asking, Samuel says, I am the seer. Now, he says some words that are heavy with an innuendo at that point. And Saul is thinking, why are you telling me this? And so when Samuel tells him to come for sacrifice so that he can anoint him, Saul says, but me, of the least clan, of the least tribe of Israel. Are you sure? This is what we consider humility to be, isn't it? To refuse. God has an agenda. God has a plan for his church, for the workplace, for the world. But me, no, it can't be. And we go on and say, wow, what a humble man of God. And even later, when he's supposed to be anointed, mafuta iko hapo, mtumishi ako hapo, watu wako hapo, Saul ako hapo. Saul is not there. Where is the? And they say he's hiding among the supplies. He means it. He's humble. No, I don't think it should be me. And they call him and anoint him. No, God has an agenda for Israel. Now go forth. Whatever you find in your hands to do, do, because God is with you. That's what Samuel tells him. Have you heard this? Have you ever heard of someone or seen someone experience this, where someone is given a position of influence, a position of power, because God intends to use them, and they say, no, how can God want me? Have you ever seen that? And then it turns out later they never were as humble as they portrayed themselves to be. Have you ever seen that? Or are you that person who knows how to portray humility and say, no, really me, a real group leader? No, me. It turns out that all this humility from Saul was an act. None of the taking care of his father's donkeys had done anything to his heart. He had never become a true shepherd in obscurity. Contrast this to David, who also comes from obscurity, has been taking care of his father's sheep. He did his job as a shepherd as unto the Lord. Why we know this is because when no one was watching, no sheep were singing praises to him. He tells of when a lion came to attack the sheep, and he, in the strength of God, God helped him, and he removed the sheep from the mouth of the lion and of the bear by the strength of God. And so we know that in his jobs, whatever it is he would do, it would never be in his name, or he's always kind of aware that it is God who helps me to do 1, 2, 3 things. He does his job as unto the Lord. David was a good shepherd, not a hired hand, who runs when he sees wolves coming. And I wonder, in your workplace, are you a good shepherd or are you a hired hand? You know, the world is rife with teachings such as, do not enrich another person. Don't break your sweat for another person's gain. Work hard only for your own thing. Use that space you're in to start your own business, start your own company, start your own thing. That's where you should pour your sweat. That's where you should put your energy. If you work a minute extra, they must pay you. Good shepherd, hired hand. Do you work as unto the Lord? Those few sheep that are not yours, do you protect them with your life? Do you protect your boss's resources with your life? Or every opportunity you get, you eat the sheep? Let alone leave the lion to take the sheep. You yourself are the lion. In obscurity, do you work as unto the Lord? Do you give your all even when it's not your thing? And again, the world will tell us it is in the darkness that you are, in the incubation, that you are formed, that you are prepared to be. For God to, when he puts you in the limelight, they will see what was happening in the darkness. Will they, or will you be like Saul? Done a lot of work in obscurity, but when you come out into the limelight, your heart never became a shepherd's heart. You may have grown in experience, in skill, in knowledge, but your heart never changed one bit. I said I would give you a definition of humility. This I get from a pastor called Tim Keller. I don't know how many of you know Tim Keller. He says, humility is not thinking of yourself, is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. To not always be concerned, what will people think, how so I need to look humble and I need to refuse. Say, me, no, it cannot be me. God cannot be choosing me. That's trying to think less of yourself, when indeed you actually don't. Humility is thinking of yourself less, being concerned with God's agenda. Okay, you want me to be that? I'm going to be that. Does God intend for me to work and as unto him, to serve him, to do this? I am going to take up that job and I'm going to serve the Lord. And people might think that's pride, but to be concerned with the agenda of God and to think of yourself less is in truth humility. So, when the Lord brings them both into the limelight to fight his battles, they are the battles of the Lord. Saul's heart stands in stark contrast to David's. He quickly forgets that it is God's agenda that he ought to be pursuing, and he becomes the center of those battles, so that when the glory shifts from him to someone else, it fills him with bitter jealousy. David, on the other hand, who has always worked as unto the Lord, trusting in God, the praises and the fame do not seem to move him, because later when he's given the king's daughter, he says, but I'm only a poor man and little known. It almost looks sarcastic because they have just sung for him. You'd imagine he'd be aware, yeah, I'm becoming that guy. But he seems to still think, I'm little known, I'm a poor man. What do the fame and the popularity doesn't get to him because his gaze is firmly fixed on God and his agenda for Israel. He was willing to give his life fighting Goliath for the sake of God's agenda for Israel. It was never about, unajua nimekuwa nikiimba huko magizani. Now I want to show these people I'm actually a warrior. They've never known. They think I'm just cute. Now I want to show. That was never his thought. And so when the praises come, he doesn't seem to recognize them. Saul shows us how dangerous it is to live for the praises of man instead of the praises of God. From the beginning, Saul cared more about what people thought than what God thought. In fact, the two times where Saul categorically disobeyed God so that God rejected him, it was because he cared what people thought. The first time, they're supposed to assemble for battle against the Philistines. Samuel says, wait for me 7 days, I'm coming to offer a sacrifice. Does Samuel come? He doesn't. And the men begin to disappear because they are afraid. They begin to slip away. Saul's heart is like, no, if I lose this battle, it's like in his mind, if I lose this battle, it's my name on the line. It's the king of Israel who lost. It's not God, because it's not God's agenda anymore. It's my agenda. So if I lose this battle, what will they say of me as a king? So what does he do? He goes ahead to offer the sacrifice. Later, the second time is when he was told, clear off the Amalekites. But what does he do? He spares King Agag and all the fat sheep and goats and all of that. And when Samuel asks him, why did you not do what the Lord said? He says, the men said. that we should keep them. And me, I was afraid of them. He always cared what men thought more than what God thought. He had been carried on the praises of people so that when their criticism came, as they sang for David, it threatened to crush him. And he determined in his heart, even if I'm going to stand against God, I will crush David. I will crush the source of my pain. The one who stands against me, instead of me receiving the praise and the glory, he is receiving it. I will stand against God and crush him, get him out of the picture so that I don't lose the praise and the glory that comes from men. Why? Because he lived for the praises of men, and the criticism of men nearly crushed him. If you find that in your heart you're carried too high by praise and popularity, and you're crushed too deeply by criticism and scorn, watch out. For sin crouches at your door and it desires to have you. The only solution, if you find that you are like this, the only solution is to realign yourself with the agenda and the plan of God. Find out what God is seeking to do at your workplace. Find out. You've never quite maybe thought what God's agenda is. You're always thinking, how much will I get from this job? Will it help me to rise in my career? Will it do this and the other? That's usually your focus. Change your focus. Ask yourself, because God is at work. I am part of the kingdom of God. The agenda is that God will save all men. What is God doing at my workplace? What is God doing in my personal sphere, in my life, in my family, at my real group level, in my church? What is God doing? What is God doing in the world? And as you begin to see what God is doing, you will be able to say, as David said, I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God. God, you want your people to worship? I am not given songs to lead by Kavesu because my voice is not so good. But the agenda is that God's people worship. I'm gonna be part of that worship. I'm not given a microphone to do it. But the agenda is that God's people experience this. I'm going to do the least of the jobs. I would rather be a doorkeeper so long as God's agenda is being fulfilled. I would rather be the one who serves tea at the workplace so long as God's agenda is being fulfilled. If you realign your heart and find out what it is that God is doing, because God is always at work, then you remove yourself from being caught up with the praises of men and being crushed too much by the criticism of men. You focus on God and you are okay. If he puts you in a high position, you take the tunics and you step into that position. And if he tells you you're going to be a doorkeeper, you do it. Because what's high in your mind is the agenda of God, not your personal agenda. I want to push this theme of jealousy a little further. And I know it might be uncomfortable. And maybe some of you are squirming in your seats and wondering, atamaliza si tumesikia, ni hivyo. But let's clean the wound so that it can heal. Verse 19 tells us that the songs threatened to crush Saul. And so what did he do? He kept a close eye on David. It says, let me read from verse 8. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. The word used there implies that Saul was watching David with suspicion, as if he was already guilty and worthy of punishment. And in fact, that's what you feel when you're jealous of someone. You already determine in your heart they are guilty of something. And this something is that they have wronged you. Somehow, in your heart, you feel wronged. And they are worthy of punishment. You see, God had already rejected Saul twice, as I mentioned earlier. And Saul, when Saul told him that God had rejected him, Saul said, and God has already anointed another. The first time he said that. Then the second time he said, and God has chosen your neighbor to be king. Now, this is Saul. My neighbor, see, he starts to look around. Ni nani? Huyu ako hapa around me. Who is about to take my position? So when David comes from nowhere and kills Goliath, and then the people begin to love him, it is possible that Saul begins to think, is this that neighbor who Samuel said has been taken? And you know, Saul, if you read the story, when you're observing closely, you realize Saul doesn't say a lot of those things. He thinks in his mind, let the Philistines do that. He thinks in his mind, I'm going to pin David to the wall. He thinks in his mind, what more can he have by the king, but the kingdom? He never quite verbalizes them. When he verbalizes things, he says, tell him that the king likes him. Yeah? And so he's watching. And you know when you're suspicious and you're worried, this person is taking your position, this person is not, you're always like this. You know what I mean? And in your bed at home, David says in Psalms, him while he's sleeping, he's thinking of God. When I lie upon my bed, I think of you. All night long, my heart, that's what David is doing. The jealous one, Saul, is thinking, when he said that, is this what he meant? Is he planning to do this? What is his, when he's close to my son, you know, suspicion, corrupted. Your eyes are corrupted, your ears are corrupted, your heart, your thoughts are corrupted. All you're seeing is how this person is planning to oust you and how you need to work it out so that he doesn't do that. So, Saul probably figured out that David was the chosen one. Blinded by anger, fear, jealousy, he resolves to stand against God and to take David out. So, he tries to kill him himself 4 times. This is this chapter 18. At least 4 times, but he fails. And so what does he do? He puts his children, 3 of his children at risk because he's going after David. Because now you become blinded. You know, the same way David is focused on God's agenda. I can die, Goliath might kill me, but I'm going to seek God's agenda, God's salvation for Israel. Saul, same focus, but on himself. And so he puts 3 of his children in danger. 1, Merab, because he says, let me give her to him so that she becomes a snare for him, because the Philistines will come against him. Why? Because when you're the king's son-in-law, you have the king's daughter. Of course, the Philistines count you as part of the enemies, isn't it? So he would rather put his daughter in that position for the sake of. And you know, when they will kill, they will not just kill David. See, usually they wipe out the whole family. Even his daughter and his grandchildren gone, just so that he can get David out. Second person is Michal. And he says, go get me the foreskins. And he's hoping David dies. And in this case, his daughter was going to be heartbroken. Because in this case, the daughter loves David, isn't it? Wewe utakuwa sawa, watu upona heartbreaks. I don't care what happens to you. The third one is Jonathan. At some point when Jonathan, this is later in the story, when Jonathan gives David permission so that he doesn't come, because David tells Jonathan, your father wants to kill me. And Saul discovers, now Jonathan, unakwanga mjinga aje, you can't see that this person is coming for your kingdom. And he hurls his spear at his own son to kill the very one he wants to protect. But it turns out he never even wants the throne for his son. He wants the throne for himself. 3 of his children in danger because blinded by anger, fear, jealousy, he pursues David to get what he wants. He is at the smack center of, let me say, the agenda of life. He's not seeing God, he's seeing only himself. Jealousy is dangerous and expensive. If any one of you has ever given in to jealousy and acted blindly, because it became worse and worse, maybe you have experienced what it has cost you. It corrupts your seeing, your hearing, your thoughts. You're suspiciously watching to see. And you know, because we are believers, sometimes we can see when God's hand is on someone. And that terrifies us. Because you can tell God is for this person, but you can consider, it's like the devil who said, I will stand against God. I will become God. Because you know that's what we do. We can do that as humans. Is I can see God's hand is on this person, but I can stand against God. Jealousy can do that to us. Be watchful. As I said earlier, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. In conclusion, let me finish by saying something that I had mentioned it earlier when I spoke about David's and Jonathan's friendship. I mentioned that later in the story we find how this friendship serves to encourage David in very difficult and painful times. And this is what I want to leave you with. David is on the run. Saul is in hot pursuit. This is in chapter 23, 1 Samuel 23. I want to read from verse 15. I think Jonathan sneaks out of the camp because Saul is in hot pursuit. Of course, he is with Abner, with the soldiers, and obviously Jonathan is there because Jonathan also is a warrior, a man of war. And so they are pursuing David together, but Jonathan's heart is with David. So I think he sneaks out of camp, and this is what it says from verse 15. While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. And this is how he helped him to find strength in God. He said, "Do not be afraid. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this." The two of them made a covenant again before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, and David remained at Horesh. You see, I think Jonathan knew how discouraged David could get. We in later times who read the Psalms, we know how much David cries. We know how much David is broken and crushed by how people betray him, by how Saul goes after him, by how God seems to have forgotten him. He even maybe had forgotten that God had made a promise over his life and his agenda for Israel through him. And Jonathan, being one in spirit with David, being his very godly committed friend, must have known, my friend is prone to discouragement. My friend is prone to forgetting what God has intended and planned for him. And so we are pursuing him. I know where he is at, what he's feeling. And so what am I going to do? I will sneak out and I will go to my friend and I will help him to find strength in God, and I will remind him of God's promise over his life. It looks like you're going to die, but you will not die. God has an agenda for you. Helps him to find strength in God. You know, for some of you, God has already gifted you with godly friendships. You already have this thing that we're talking about David and Jonathan, and you know how your friend can be. You know maybe they are prone to discouragement. You know they are prone to being in spaces for too long. Maybe you know that in this particular season, they're in a very difficult time. Here's what I want to charge you to do. To be their Jonathan. This week, go and help them to find strength in God. Go and remind them of God's promise over their life. Go and remind them that God will never leave them. He will never forsake them. Be their Jonathan this week. So, David is on the run. Saul is in hot pursuit. Next week, we will look at something that happens while he's on the run and Saul in hot pursuit. One very major event that happens while he's out there. God bless you.